You get two cover slides today. All right, I'm Trevor, also known as Tnorm. I'm the governance lead at Gauntlet. I was previously at Boost Protocol, which is an incentives protocol. Before that, I was on the Masari team at Masari Governor. I've been involved in a lot of DAO stuff. I also enjoy being outside. But to tell you a little bit about Gauntlet governance, Gauntlet is a pretty large delegate in the space. Gauntlet is a DeFi quantitative research firm. We do risk management, we do treasury management, we do incentive optimization, and kind of all things DeFi, right? And as part of that, Gauntlet has traditionally, and really since the beginning, been very involved with DAOs and decentralization, right? So I joined the team in July. I joined as governance lead and basically have inherited the fun of work that comes with being a delegate in all of these and more communities. So contracts are greater than councils. This is I have lots of theses and theories about DAOs that I pontificate about. This is one of them. I think it's particularly relevant to what we're doing at Gauntlet, so I'm excited to walk through it with you all. I want to start by kind of going back to the Stone Ages and the beginning in 2019 when Vitalik said in a piece about DACs, actually, decentralized autonomous corporations, exploring the idea of DAOs that they're really about automation at the center and humans at the edges. And I think as the space has evolved and we've seen more and more DAOs pop up, we've kind of forgotten that most of this is supposed to not involve us, right? These are supposed to be autonomous protocols operating on their own. And really, Vitalik pontificated at the time that DAOs should be focused on kind of two main things. One is funding public goods, and that would be public goods to build upon the structures that the DAOs are governing, right? Like the protocols, so Ethereum, Arbitrum, Uniswap. And the second piece would be essentially to oversee protocol maintenance and upgrades, and that the stakeholders should be investing in each of these tracks their time and their energy and their expertise to ensure that the right decisions are being made. The path that the space has chosen to adopt to do this is basically a legislative process, right? And we've borrowed a lot from democracies and democratic republics and previous kind of democratic processes to do this, where essentially we have an ideation phase. If you want to affect change in a DAO or on a protocol that has a DAO, you need an idea. Over time, it becomes formalized to a proposal. People argue about it. Myself, many of you in the room here, debate about it, and then it's put to a vote, and the community tries to find consensus, right? And the most important part of this, or one of the most important parts of this, is when consensus is reached, that proposal is executed. And really, we find ourselves in a terribly awkward position where it's basically one half corporate governance and one half democracy, right? So we have these kind of notions of token-weighted governance, similar in some respects to stakeholders in a company. You have incentive alignment, theoretically, but really you're building or you're overseeing a product or a service. These protocols are products and services. And on the other side, we've elected to choose a completely democratic governance legislative process to make those changes happen. There's a public forum, there's transparency and openness, and it's kind of an awkward match. But that isn't to say important innovations haven't been made. So I think it's helpful here, and kind of with the backdrop of the election, it's probably a good time to make this comparison. But there's really 3 steps in a legislative process, and in an entity that is overseeing legislation. And that's one is to create rules, right? You need to create the rules that you want to govern by. You need to enact those rules, and someone needs to interpret those rules. And in government, we do that in the US at least, with three branches, right? The legislative branch, Congress. It does those first 4 steps of the process I showed earlier with the ideation, the debate, the consensus, and then it needs to be enacted. And in government, we have the executive branch to do that. And then it needs to be interpreted. And the judicial branch is there to interpret the rules when they're created and also all the way down the line if they're being followed, essentially. At DAOs, delegates fill the role of Congress. But it gets really interesting because we now can actually enact rules without having humans involved. We can actually have smart contracts execute the changes on chain immediately. And that's actually, I think, a important innovation. And then even more importantly, which is why blockchains are valuable in the first place, is the judicial branch can actually be replaced by validators who we trust to enforce those rules on chain. And that's pretty cool. This conference, or today has been pretty bearish in terms of people saying that governance is stalled and all this, but I think this is actually really interesting. The problem is that we haven't fully executed that vision, in my opinion. So for protocol maintenance and upgrades, kind of this like part 1 of what Vitalik said DAOs were originally created to do, we actually do all right? I think the most mature DAOs have entirely on-chain execution. Smart contracts enforce this codified governance. There's checks and balances if need be. Lido's been exploring dual governance. They have optimistic governance. All this is happening on-chain. And then the blockchain basically serves the judicial branch to enforce. Now, when we get to the other side, which I put in parentheses Treasury, because I think most of the space has basically dropped the idea of public goods funding for the pursuit of revenue models and kind of a longer form sustainability, maybe to support public goods, maybe to redistribute revenue. That's kind of a sidetrack that I'll try not to get on. But my point here is there's only partially on-chain execution in most cases when we talk about public goods funding and Treasury type proposals. Usually what happens is the enactment, the execution happens on-chain, and then they're sent to a bunch of multi-sigs, right? They're sent to a bunch of people who are probably in this room who are sitting there signing transactions, and there's 0 to none actual blockchain enforcement. We're basically losing the entire judicial branch as soon as we pass something through the Treasury. And that creates the council problem, and the council problem is a human problem. This is kind of like stealing off AI podcasters, but talking about when there's nothing left for humans to do. But they make a good point that humans are really good at strategic thinking. We're really good at creativity, and we're good at debating and challenging ideas. We're really bad at perfection. We're actually horrible at perfection. We're really bad at coordination, and we're pretty terribly inefficient when it comes to operational things. And a lot of times I would argue the most like creative people are even worse at operational efficiency. But the council problem kind of highlights all of that, right? We get terrible redundancy on the operational side. I mean, multi-sigs are literally, I don't trust Christoph himself to manage this transaction, so I'm going to have 5 people basically do that transaction as well. And we're just going to say 5x people doing the transaction limits the chance that the transaction will be done wrong. It's kind of what that says, right? It's extremely redundant, and we're brute forcing perfection by instilling redundancy. Then there's governance capture. This is a meme that was in the Arbitrum delegate chat that I thought was pretty funny. They pasted some people's profile pictures over these heads, but I didn't want to carry that over. But it says, it's McGonagall saying, why is it when something happens, it's always you3? And Uniswap, Arbitrum, Optimism, you'll notice a lot of the same people are sitting on these councils, and it does kind of lead to how decentralized the system actually is. And lastly, it's just costly, right? Like, we get into, similar to governance capture, people want to pay themselves. You need to pay people to do the work. There's only a small group of people who are even interested in this. So, yeah, councils are pretty obnoxious and bad. And all this to say, protocols really struggle with kind of efficient treasury operations in general, right? They use manual processes. They use multiple vendors. On-chain coordination is slow. Kind of all these points I've been hammering home about. So how can we close the gap between protocol upgrades, and which are pretty on-chain, pretty efficient, and kind of these DAO funding proposals? And really, how can we bring autonomous execution while maintaining transparency, taking advantage of composability, and making sure it's all affordable? This is where Era steps in. If you thought it was all going to be just general pontificating without a little bit of product, you were wrong. That's a legal disclaimer. We'll also skip that. Introducing the Era protocol, autonomous data-driven treasury operations and management. So what is the Era protocol? Era is a protocol that is essentially a vault, right? But it's a non-custodial vault. And that means that whoever deposits their funds can withdraw or deposit and actually set entire parameters for what that vault can do. And you can put strategies that are fully automated. It's completely transparent and auditable. And that sounds kind of boring. And that's because it is. And much like governance contracts, contracts are inherently boring, but what's interesting is what you can do with it. And I think this is where we start to get into the idea that treasury operations and treasury management and treasury proposals should start to inherit these execution capabilities and kind of like judicial blockchain capabilities that I talked about earlier. And you can have treasury management strategies, right? You can have stablecoin strategies where the DAO actually selects certain assets or certain protocols that they want to integrate with, and then you can have third parties come in. You can have your favorite councils, if you still want to keep councils, come in and execute those, or you can have them completely automated. What's even more interesting, and I know we had a treasury management panel earlier, but I'm actually way more interested in treasury operations. And what I mean by that is tokens are multidimensional. Treasury management is much more than managing your financials and your runway. We have so many DAOs in the space delegating tokens to delegates. We have protocol-owned liquidity. Basically, like, token liquidity is your Silk Road. You can only do business where your token is in a lot of ways, right? And now with composability, with DeFi, lending markets, you need to bootstrap an entire marketplace for your token. And there's ways to do this with Era that are maintaining and extending that on-chain infrastructure in a way that actually frees up the DAO and the delegates working in the DAO to have more strategic goals and strategic thinking rather than spending their time on council elections. And so it all kind of revolves around this is pretty marketing-y, but an all-in-one solution for treasury operations and management. But it really is basically pretty simple. And I've kind of beat this dead, so I won't spend too much time on this. But Era works by making a deposit, setting a objective function and a list of assets. And then we implement something called a guardian, right? And a guardian is essentially someone who oversees the strategy that you want this vault to do. And it's completely non-custodial. And the entire community can view this vault performance and manage the funds that are in that vault using a public dashboard, right? So it kind of works, as this diagram shows, as I've described before. I don't know, but there's not really anything else to add here. You can just, if you're a visual learner, that might help. But guardians have very, very, very specific roles. And this is where I think we get the advantage of the on-chain benefits here. Because guardians essentially sit at the strategic layer, whereas the entire operational layer here is actually taking place on chain. So while guardians can't withdraw funds, they can't move funds, and they can't mess around with fees without the owner's permission, which in this case could be the DAO governor contract, or it could be a multi-sig elected. The guardians can actually use all of their knowledge that they get from off-chain algorithms to inform recommendations to run extremely specific strategies, whether it's protocol and liquidity, whether it's incentive optimization, or treasury management. And so a lot of protocols have started to use Era, and they've done a few different things. And I'm really excited about where this goes in the future. But today, the Era protocol is pretty new on the scene. And we've started to work with a few DAOs specifically, and I think Arbitrum and Compound are 2 DAOs worth mentioning here, who are using Era for token conversion. So these DAOs have elected to use Gauntlet as a guardian on the Era protocol, and essentially have created a vault that is non-custodial where their native token can go in, and the quantitative research team at Gauntlet can design strategies to set up one-sided liquidity in Uniswap v3 and create extremely efficient execution. Whereas otherwise, you would have to basically go through a foundation, like the Arbitrum Foundation or the Uniswap Foundation, into a black box where they would essentially go to a market maker and have this transition done. You can now have it completely done on chain. Even more interestingly, we're talking with a few of the governance tooling providers to essentially abstract all this away to a point where you could potentially put in a proposal, right, and say, instead of ARB, I want USDC for my program. And all this could happen in the background. And you have this entire operational efficiency abstracted away from the delegates so that they can focus on what really matters. With Morpho, actually just yesterday, we passed a proposal for Morpho, who's about to enable transferability, to have their protocol-owned liquidity on Era. And Gauntlet is the guardian on that vault. So now you have a DAO that is going to deposit Morpho and RepDETH and needs a really, really, really sophisticated strategy as the DAO launches transferability that can provide protocol-owned liquidity at an extremely wide range so that it can absorb all that volatility. And then, as volatility drops, essentially tighten that liquidity range, allowing, without eating into other LPs' fees. There's a lot of like tactical stuff going on here, and essentially set the stage for even more efficient incentive optimization when Morpho decides to eventually start doing token incentives, right? And then treasury management. This, like I said, I'm much more interested in the treasury operations stuff, some of the more abstract DeFi stuff, but treasury management is critical. Era provides the opportunity to kind of set parameters for whatever the DAO is comfortable with, for whatever assets the DAO wants to pursue. You can have third-party guardians, you can have multiple guardians in different vaults, utilizing different strategies to meet a DAO's specific goals, and it's all kind of viewable on the app. Currently, Era is charging no fees, no lockups, and it is audited. And right now, we're working across many partners. The TVL is knocking on 100 million. I think we just need a bit more love from the Trump push here to get over 100 million. So that'll be very exciting. There's 5 live strategies, but yeah, that's Era Finance. So thank you guys. Any questions? The TVL, so Era is being used by DAOs, and it's also being used by funds, private investors, all that. So Compound, I think 2 out of the 3 largest vaults right now are Compound. They just passed a proposal to do some treasury management type stuff there. And then they also have all the Compound vendor payments are actually sitting in a Era vault earning yield in USDC. Being deposited in Compound. So Compound is I think there's 8 million in that vault, that vendor payment vault. So it's substantial. Yeah.
Any other questions? You. No, not you. Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you, Tnorm.